Our speaker for this session is Hayley Orndorf, and she'll be talking to us about open and accessible, improving STEM OER using accessibility framework.
All right, thank you so much. So as I get started here again, I'm going to chat a link to the slides, just in case you would prefer to follow along on your own device. And there are some links in there that you might want to click as we go through. Okay, so I'm glad everyone decided to stick around. So while this talk and my previous one on universal design for learning are definitely related, neither is contingent on the other. So welcome, and I've tried to avoid significant overlap between content. So I'm Hayley Orndorf. I work for BioQUEST, a nonprofit organization focused on STEM education reform through faculty professional development. And at BioQuest, I focus on initiatives around open educational resources and universal design for learning, which is why I'm here tonight. And I'm also finishing up my master's in learning design and technology at Purdue University. So since we are having a couple more folks join us, I am going to run through the norms that I have listed out here. And I actually will take a minute to chat those slides again, just in case you would like to follow along on your own device. So welcome everyone. The norms. First, I will invite you to interrupt me with questions or have some discussion points at the end or things to, if you have a question, feel free to interject, but please do state your name before speaking, like with "this is Hayley" or "Hayley here," just because not everyone can always see the screen for many reasons to see who's talking. And it's helpful to hear other people pronounce their own name. So these are just kind of norms that I like to share whenever I'm presenting or really in a Zoom room at all. The other, use communication channels that work for you. Again, verbally is fine. You can also chat. If you chatted a question and I don't see it, maybe if the host could interject and just let me know, that would be great. And then consider adding your pronouns to your name. You can do this by changing your name in Zoom if that works for you. Okay, on to the outline. So in this session, I want to dig into accessibility, particularly the accessibility of STEM open educational resources. And to do that, I want to look at ISKME's STEM OER Accessibility Framework, a practical guide for curators and authors of STEM open educational resources. I was actually a member of the advisory group that developed the framework, and now I reference it all the time when working with faculty in professional development about universal design for learning or in addressing their biology teaching generally. So I'll share a bit more about the project and partners that developed the framework, explain the very intentional design of the guide, and then spend some time looking through the framework together and considering how to use this tool to evaluate and remediate your own material to be more accessible. Okay, so the STEM OER Accessibility Framework is the result of a collaboration between ISKME, the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management and Education, and SERC, the Science Education Resource Center at Carleton College. And these organizations led the development of the framework through a grant program offered by the SCORE Sustainability Challenges for Open Education Resources to promote an equitable undergraduate biology education network. So many acronyms. So again, I was an accessibility advisor on the project. The goal was to create tools and descriptors and language that support faculty in determining if the OER they find and create meet their campus accessibility requirements and the needs of their learners. So to unpack the design of the development and the framework, I just want to go through the name, ensuring we're all on the same page about these additional acronyms and sort of explain why the framework is designed the way it is and what it covers. So STEM, why STEM? Well, as you know, science, technology, engineering and mathematics materials have a lot of elements that could be challenging to make accessible, particularly if they're not designed to be accessible from the outset. Things like complex visualizations, maps, equations, and extensive vocabulary can be intimidating to make accessible, both technically and cognitively. OER. OER stands for Open Educational Resources, which are educational materials of any kind that are entirely free to access and licensed in a way that allows for use, reuse, adaptations, and sharing of those adaptations. So free to use, openly licensed, typically with a Creative Commons license. There are 6 of those, and then allow participation in the OER life cycle by being findable, adaptable, usable, and you're allowed to share those adaptations back to the community. OER is really a central principle in supporting true access by reducing cost barriers and allowing for immediate use and adaptation. So an instructor can quickly adapt material to improve accessibility because they're not worried about the license. This not only benefits their learners, but then they can share it back to the community to benefit other learners and instructors. So that's really why OER is so central to this framework. Accessibility. So accessibility is important for many reasons. The first of which, it's the law. So the term accessible is defined by the Office for Civil Rights in the US Department of Education. And the paraphrase definition is ensuring an individual with a disability has the same opportunities as an individual without a disability. So ensuring someone with a disability has the opportunity to have the same experiences, get the same information, engage in the same interactions as someone without a disability in an equally effective manner with generally equivalent like ease of use. Now, designing accessible materials from the outset is really beneficial to all learners, not just those with disabilities. And that's where the term OER accessibility expands the legal definition to include the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and principles of open education. Does this by providing multiple options for a variety of people, regardless of disability status, using frameworks like Universal Design for Learning and POUR, P-O-U-R, which we'll get to next. So framework, finally, the Universal Design for Learning and POUR, Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, Robust frameworks were used to develop this framework. So UDL is a tool for designing flexible, adaptable learning environments by removing unnecessary barriers to learning, achieved by offering multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. POUR, Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, Robust, is an acronym developed by W3C, the leading standard for online accessibility. So if we put all of this together, it leads to the STEM OER Accessibility Framework, which is organized into 5 sections, POURS, and the S is for STEM. So now let's get to the actual framework. It's a physical guidebook. I am going to open it up on my screen, but I would encourage you to do that on your own device. I'm going to chat the link to it just so we all can open that up and look through it on our own, and I'll make you a little dizzy as I get back to the top here. So we're all starting from the same place. Okay, so let's look at the organization and get oriented to the guide together. So all of the background we just covered is in the introduction. So it's there for your reference. Then looking at the central framework, you can see that each section corresponds to an element of POUR, so perceivable, and then there are subtopics in those that relate. So in perceivable, we address things like color contrast, alternative text, captions. So let's jump down to perceivable. And then we have, again, our elements or our subtopics. And when you get get here to element 1, you're presented with a question about your material. Is the typeface of the resource readable? And if you're just getting started with accessibility, you might read this question and think, I don't know. Well, great. Jump down to the definition and the tips to find out, right? So every element has a definition and tips that's bookmarked. So you jump down there. And here you have the definition. What is this really referring to? Considerations, why this is important, the types of learners and situations this affects, and then tools and resources for addressing this element. So checking your material to see if the typeface is readable or a list of readable fonts, right? So there are resources here to help you remediate to be more accessible. And this applies for all sections. And then you can return to where you were in the checklist. You can hop back up and keep working through. Now, if I jump to understandable, we'll start to see where things go beyond technical accessibility or maybe that narrow legal version. So if I'm in understandable, you start to hit on things like clarity. Are the directions clear? Is the writing clear? Is the content relevant and relatable to learners? So again, there are these questions here, definitions, and if you don't know if your writing's clear, you can hop down there and there are some tools to start evaluating that. Skim through robust. And if I get to STEM, there are ideas for very STEM specific elements like equations and complex visualizations. So that is a very brief tour of the guidebook. You're not going to get familiar with it in this short presentation. You'll get the most out of it if you sit down and try to use it. So I have some suggestions for doing that. If I head back to my slides. So I suggest really, truly, if you want to learn how to use the guidebook, evaluate material you already use with the guide. Start with a relatively small resource that you are familiar with. If possible, use something you've written, you've developed. Ideally, you have shared it as OER with an open license somewhere too, but that's not a requirement. And then what I do when I'm evaluating something, I make a copy of the guidebook for myself, and then I can use it as a worksheet and I can make notes in it, I can mark it up, and I rename it for that resource and just actually work through that version for that specific material. And then read through your resource and work through the guide. So do your best to answer the questions, take cursory reads of the definitions to conduct your evaluation. And that's very key. I suggest to limiting yourself to evaluation first. Don't dive into the tools and remediation on your first go. Just work on understanding what these things mean and determining if your resource is accessible along that spectrum. Once you do that, you can turn to remediating. So when you've conducted an evaluation, make a plan for remediation. Start with things that will be most impactful. So where are your learners already struggling, right? Do you have places where you might want to offer more cohesive organization or clear directions? Where do learners ask you questions? Where do you have to reteach? Start there at a place that will be impactful and see if there are broad accessibility concerns there that you might want to address. This is where you can dive into the examples and resources, look at those considerations and the tools, and start determining how you can address any accessibility concerns in the material. As a faculty member, if you are a faculty member, as opposed to an instructional designer or a content creator, I do not suggest diving into everything all at once. Start with things impactful to your students and those things that you can make a habit. So rather than jumping to STEM and trying to dig into how to make equations accessible, while important, maybe don't start there. Think about building a practice of always using appropriate headers. But that's something really important for both cognitive accessibility and those folks who use screen readers. So even in Google Docs where you're working alone, use the correct headers, heading 1, 2, 3. Learn how to change them to adjust the style to meet your needs. Use links appropriately. So make informative links rather than bold hyperlinks. These smaller things can help you build up an accessible practice that becomes a habit. This is a much better approach than trying to do everything all at once, getting overwhelmed, and then just ultimately doing nothing. Again, I would suggest tying this back to open education. Once you've made revisions to your material, I would encourage you to share it so others can benefit from them. And finally, know when you need to seek extra support. So you're coming to this, I'm assuming, as the subject matter expert, right? Not the accessibility expert. That doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility, but it means you need to know where your limits are and when to ask for support. So I hope that the guidebook gives you support in using the language and asking the right questions of others. Then remember that accessible STEM content is a partnership, right? You might find someone at your Center for Teaching and Learning or Office of Student Services who is an accessibility expert. You have to bring that content knowledge and unpack the point or the purpose for them and explain what needs to be conveyed. And the accessibility expert can help you in conveying that in an accessible manner. Because no one out there is an expert in all STEM content and all domains of accessibility, unless you know them, and please send them my way. I have questions for them. I'd love to meet them. So I just hope that the guidebook can equip you to start evaluating your material for through an accessibility lens, get started in remediation, and then give you paths to move forward. So with that, I will take any broad questions or general questions about the framework. And I do have some examples to work through together if people are interested in that, but I'll pause to take any questions.
Thank you, Hayley. Any questions? So, oh, Enric, yeah.
Oh, no, I was going to say that I was going to ask for examples. So
Okay.
they're welcome. Yeah.
Good. Well, we can look through an example together. Maybe that will raise questions too. Okay, good. So I just have a really simple example. I like to start with images because I think they can be a bit intimidating, but they're very common, right? We all use images in our teaching and in instructional materials. So I like to look at images together and work through how to make them accessible. Now, if we let me pull up my example here. So if you're seeing the screen, I pulled this from a very basic OpenStax book on calculus and a section on differential equations, right? We have figure 1, family of solutions to the differential equation y prime equals 2x. That's the figure caption. Now, I want us to work through together how we might make this image accessible. Okay, so I would encourage you to think about what the purpose of this image is, right? It has a figure caption, but is that really conveying all of the key information in this image? And then I would invite you all to take a stab at generating a textual equivalent for it. So if you open the STEM OER accessibility framework and we go even just back to perceivable, basic images, we don't have to get to the STEM stuff yet. Alternative text for images. Do all non-decorative images include alternative text? Well, you might read that and think, I'm not exactly sure what decorative means in this case, right? So decorative are just things that have not conveying any information, like a background. Alternative text. Oh, yes. Sorry, I can share the framework too. Hold on. Thank you. So all images need a textual equivalent that can come through the form of alternative text, which is an HTML element that you add in your editor, whether that editor is Microsoft Word or Google Docs or your LMS. Or it can be a contextual description. So if, for example, you have a really complex visualization, you're not going to be able to describe it effectively in the alternative text. You might need to link to a long description. You might need to provide a description in the surrounding text. So those are the things to think about. In this case, I think we could do it with alternative text. So you can read here kind of through the definition and the consideration. For decorative images like uninformative backgrounds, you just leave it empty. And then the example here for this bird photo might read, a Costa's hummingbird with its vibrant purple cap and throat sitting on a tree branch, right? It conveys this information. Now, the tricky part is what the purpose is up to you, right? The alternative text will be different if this is on a slide as opposed to if it's on an assessment. Right, so that alternative text will change. So go ahead and look through the information about images. And then I have our figure here. And I would invite you to just chat an alternative text for that image. It is a lot. It is a lot of information to convey. Let's see. Enrique has. I'm going to read it aloud. And I want you, as I read it aloud, just, imagine that you, for any reason, cannot access this visual. Maybe you have a visual impairment. Maybe the image didn't load. Maybe you have a slow internet connection. Those are all reasons that people might not be able to access the image. So you have a set of axes with 5 curves. Each curve is a parabola. They are vertically displaced, with C -4 being the lowest one and C4 being the highest one. I think that's a pretty great alternative text, right? You're capturing the intent of that image, right? You are conveying the point that there are multiple parabolas on there, all in the family of solutions to the differential equation y prime equals 2x. It's great that that's not repeated because that is in the figure captions. We don't have to repeat that information. Another good thing about this alternative text is that it avoids using the word image or figure that is implied in the fact that the screen reader is going through alternative text. That's fantastic. Again, the alternative text will change based on your context and your purpose. If you were using this in an assessment and asking the learner to come up with a potential differential equation that this could be a family solutions for, you might provide different information. I will chat with you what the OpenStax alternative text was. They do a good job of providing accessible images. So this is what they had: a graph of a family of solutions to the differential equation y prime equals 2x, which are of the form y equals x squared plus c. Parabolas are drawn for values of c equals -4, -2, 0, 2, and 4. Right? So very similar to Enrique's. It added the additional information of where all the parabolas are, but as we know, those are just kind of representative, as the parabolas could be anywhere. They don't necessarily have to be those whole numbers in increments of 2. So that is just sort of a first step in thinking about accessible images. And again, if you look through the guidebook, oh, that's great. OpenStax images maintain their alt text. If you use them in a Word, so you can copy them and they keep the alt text. So that's a good resource also for getting started with complex STEM images, is looking through OpenStax, because they are accessible and that can help you think about how to address similar problems of your own images. We are getting, I think we are over time now, but I I just wanted to point out that I have some resources in the slides, and I'll share those again because I know some folks came in after. Obviously, a link to the framework. I have a Canvas course that's open called Image Accessibility in STEM. I actually designed it, and it's open for anyone. You can work through it on your own, and it really digs into image accessibility. And then WebAIM is another great resource that's referenced a lot in the guidebook for checking things like color contrast or elements of accessibility. My email is in my slides as well, back in my intro. If you have any questions or you want to chat more about this, I'm happy to do that. It's my favorite thing to talk about. So,
Thank you so much. Any quick questions for Hayley?
Yeah, so I do have a question. So are there any image formats which include more information like by themselves? I mean, you're describing this thing about alt text, but are there images that come embedded with information of what they are?
not beyond alternative text. No, so that image type won't affect that. When I was talking about long descriptions, that is typically a link to another page of content in your LMS or a Google document. So if you directly copied it, that would come along with it, but it's not inherently an image, it's linked. So no, there are not really differences. That alternative text is really that tag that comes with the image that you have control over. Yep. Great question.
Any other questions? All right, Hayley, thank you so much for the presentation. That was great.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And if you have any questions, please reach out to our email. It would be great. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.